And the title of 2021 Mr. Olympia goes to Big Ramy. And to the victor go the spoils. He gets the most money, the most notoriety. Let's just face it, it's good to win. So how does it come to be that a man stands in a lineup of a bunch of other dudes and some more men or women judge them accordingly and let us know at the end who the winner is? Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But to give you a basic idea, for those of you who may be new to the sport, how this stuff really works, well, basically some guys stand in a lineup and then go through what I like to call the 8 mandatory poses. Front double bicep, followed up by the front lat spread. Then we hit the side chest development. Then we turn around for the first of the 2 back shots, rear double bi, then the rear lat spread. And we turn to the side once again for the side tricep development, abs and thigh, and the last but not least, the most muscular pose. And then when the judges add it all up, they, like I said, let us know who the best guy was, who the most muscular, who the best conditioned was, and let's face it, that's what bodybuilding is all about. So when did it all begin? Historically, when people mentioned a muscular figure or a powerful human being, most people would point you towards this guy. This is Hercules, Hercules of Thebes, son of Zeus. But let's face it, guys, it is very doubtful that Hercules was a real human being. Here's another statue of a man, except this guy was a real person, a real human being, Milo of Croton. He lived in the 6th century BC, and let's face it, records at that time were spotty at best. One story of Milo that everybody does agree upon is how he garnered his great strength. As a boy, Milo decided to go out to the barn and select himself a newborn baby cow. He would then throw that poor calf on his shoulder, carry it around, and he would continue to do so each and every day until the cow put on more size, and so did Milo, until finally Milo became so strong he was able to hoist up a cow and carry that around. Can you imagine that one? Milo went on to have a legendary wrestling career and was always known for his great strength and his impressive physique. But considering there was no pictures at the time, and of course no bodybuilding, we can hardly consider Milo of Croton as the first true bodybuilder. This gentleman here, however, may be considered so. This is Ludwig Derlicher, otherwise known as Louis Attila. He was born way back in 1844 and began a strongman career in 1863. And what may be considered of not much of a physique at all for today's bodybuilding standards, for his time, Ludwig Derlicher or Louis Attila was quite a powerhouse. And what's interesting about Louis, he had a fantastic gym. Take a look at this, guys. Wow, back in the 1800s, can you imagine walking into this gym back then? Also, in the late 1800s, there was a guy by the name of Robert J. Roberts, and he was an integral part in naming bodybuilding. Now, don't get me wrong, for his time, Robert had an impressive physique, displaying perhaps what is the very first ever Christmas tree. He was more noted for the literature that he printed, in particular, The Muscles and Their Story, wherewithin he gave our beautiful sport a name, the bodybuilder. As the 1900s rapidly approached, so too did strongman Eugene Sandow. So if bodybuilding now had a name, it now had somebody to represent it. Much like Louis Attila, Eugene Sandow began as a circus strongman, and it almost appeared that he has patterned himself around Ludwig Derlicher. And the funny thing is, it's because he was. That's right, guys, Louis Attila was Eugene Sandow's trainer, I guess making Attila the very first ever bodybuilding coach. Now don't get me wrong, Eugene Sandow was a decent strongman, but he was more noted for his actual physique. He would put on what they called flex display performances. And he would actually hit a lot of the poses, a lot of the mandatory shots that they still hit today. So there's no real doubt Eugene Sandow is basically your very first ever bodybuilder. But I say basically because he had no competition, there was no titles to win, no points being awarded for his tremendous physique. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In 1901, there was an actual bodybuilding competition, and it was the very first of its kind. And what's more interesting is the guy that promoted this event was none other than Eugene Sandow. It's actually too bad that he didn't compete in this event, but to be honest, this makes him more of an integral part in our sport than being a bodybuilder ever could have. When it was all said and done, your top 3 emerged, and it's not like there was YouTube channels to report your top 3 in the local bodybuilding show back then for the great competition. Your first place winner and your very first ever bodybuilding champion, William Murray, closer shot of him there. I'd like to see a little bit more separation in the abs and a little bit more size in the legs next time. But anyway, guys, all jokes aside, what a legendary moment. In second place was D. Cooper and A.C. Smith in third. Very difficult to get any information on any of those two guys. But you may take note on the table there. There are 3, count them, 3 Sandow trophy, Sandow medals. Oh man, to have one of those babies now would be worth its weight in gold. And speaking of gold, the first place trophy was made of solid gold. Supposedly. It was found out later that it was just gold-plated. But still a fantastic trophy nonetheless. I do believe the second place was a silver Sandow statue, which would have been really cool to see. A.C. Smith received a bronze Sandow medal for his third place finish. And that's basically the exact same Sandow that you see handed out today, except on a smaller scale, of course. If Britain was going to have their great competition, then the U.S. was going to have their physical culture exhibition, which was basically the very second bodybuilding competition. It was held way back in 1903 at New York City's Madison Square Garden. The winner of that event was Hugh Jenkins, and if you ask me, this guy had a much more impressive physique than William Murray. But the frustrating part about this is the more classic bodybuilding sites I did visit, it seems that this guy may or may not be, in fact, Hugh Jenkins. I've seen this picture, and the name Albert Traylor also appeared under, so if it is Albert, or if it is, in fact, Hugh Jenkins, this guy did have a very impressive physique. This is Bernarr Macfadden, and if you want to know about the history of bodybuilding, you should definitely know who Bernarr Macfadden is. He was, of course, the promoter of the Physical Culture Exhibition in New York City in 1903. He was a bit of a bodybuilding buff himself in his younger years here, sporting a not a bad little six-pack. Pretty good physique for his time, actually. But the thing of it is, Bernarr Macfadden continued on bodybuilding events up until the 1920s. So it kind of begs the question, why is Bernarr Macfadden not more known? And not at least as known as guys like Eugene Sandow. The turn of the century was of course a watershed moment for bodybuilding, but with guys like George Hackenschmidt hanging around, with arguably the greatest physique of his time, not too many people took bodybuilding seriously. Considering that George Hackenschmidt wanted nothing to do with the organized sport of bodybuilding, it really lent no credibility to what Bernarr Macfadden was trying to produce. In the early 1920s, Sigmund Clean emerged as perhaps having the greatest physique of his time. And much like Eugene Sandow, he was trained by legendary strongman Louis Attila. Food for thought, he took over the gym ownership from Louis Attila. Not only that, but he went on to marry Louis's sister. So a fun little fact there. Sigmund actually only competed once, and it wasn't until the 1940s. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, so let's rewind back to the 1920s and take a look at this guy. Some of you may actually recognize him. It's Charles Atlas, a very famous bodybuilder. In 1922, he captured the America's Most Perfectly Developed Man title which was actually a Bernarr Macfadden show. So just goes to show you how important on bridging the gap from the early 1900s to the 20s and even 30s that Bernarr Macfadden really was. Charles Atlas went on to make his fortune in selling his own Charles Atlas course, and he used this little skit, this little comic strip at the back of magazines and at the back of actual comic books. Use this as a catalyst, and I'm telling you what, guys, I'm sure you've probably seen this before. You can read the comic strip if you want. Go ahead and pause it. It's pretty funny, but it worked and made his fortune. But he really didn't continue as a bodybuilder in terms of a competitive career is concerned. 1930 saw William T. Coggins capture the very first ever Mr. Britain competition. It was under the HSL affiliation, which stood for the Health and Strength League. Fast forward to 1938, and the AAU was established, the Amateur Athletic Union. And Burt Goodrich becomes the very first ever Mr. America. There was also a Mr. World that year in Emile Bonnet. But let's face it, guys. None of these gentlemen are what you would call any more impressive than what Eugene Sandow was bringing to the stage at the turn of the century. That is, until we seen John Grimek hit the scene. Now here was an impressive physical specimen, and in my opinion, the first guy to be able to say for sure, this guy was a superior bodybuilder to anybody else in the world. John Grimek had it all. He had big, thick, powerful limbs, huge chest, and he was an elegant poser as well. I mean, for the 1930s, this guy looks tremendous in this tilted front double bicep pose. He could also do the splits, probably or more than likely the very first ever bodybuilder to pull that move off on the stage. Grimek remained undefeated all throughout the 1940s, and in 1948 made history by winning the very first ever NABBA Mr. Universe competition. And the NABBA was established just shortly after this officially, but this was unofficially a NABBA event, which stood for the National Amateur Bodybuilding Association, of course. Grimek would finish up his career with a big win at the 1949 Mr. USA competition. Strangely enough, it was under no affiliation whatsoever. You can see Grimek sitting on his throne like a king should. You can see Steve Reeves there, and that gentleman there is George Eiferman. Steve placed third, George placed fourth. Now, inconspicuous by his absence here is this guy, Clarence Ross. Maybe they didn't want to get a picture of them two beside each other because Clarence Ross was arguably just as or maybe even better than John Grimek. Ross would place second at that 49 Mr. USA contest. He continued to compete up until the mid-50s when he decided to retire from the bodybuilding game. Steve Reeves would also retire, but not before he faced off against Reg Park at the 1950 NABBA Mr. Universe contest. It was, still till today, a debated competition in which Steve Reeves did place first over Reg Park. And you may take note, the statue that he won at that competition was in fact a Sandow statue. So a lot of history goes into the model that the IFBB uses today. Reeves would then go on to the movies, and it really paid off. The guy made a fortune in films, playing Hercules several times, and many other characters also. With Steve Reeves no longer a factor, Reg Park went on to win the 1951 Mr. Universe competition. He also went on to the movies, and just like Steve Reeves, played Hercules several times in fact. But unlike Steve Reeves, Reg would re-enter bodybuilding every so often just to re-establish himself as Mr. Universe. He did so in 1958 and again in 1965. So for the 1950s and the 60s, Reg Park established himself as the greatest bodybuilder on earth. Or did he? Also in both of those decades was Bill Pearl. He was doing the exact same thing Reg Park was doing. except they were never meeting. Coincidence? Probably not. Maybe some sort of deal was worked out between the two. Reg Park was winning in 51, 58, 65. Well, Bill Pearl won the universe in 53, 56. Well, actually, in 56, he won his class, but lost the overall to Jack Dillinger, who was no slouch himself. But Bill Pearl would go on in 61 and in 67 to capture the Mr. Universe title. Now, at this time, there was no doubt that NABBA was the biggest force in bodybuilding, but all the while, there was the IFBB, and it was ran by this guy, Joe Weider. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of Joe Weider. He was producing Mr. Universe competitions since 1952, but in 1965, he decided to try something new. He had a new event. It had a brand new, fresh name. It was called the Mr. Olympia, and it was won by Larry Scott. He is your very first ever Mr. Olympia champion. Scott returned the following year to solidify his name and becoming a two-time Mr. Olympia champion. In fourth place that year was a young man by the name of Sergio Oliva. And that young man would return the following year and win the entire competition. Now, what a physique that this guy had. He took that physique and won the title one more time, tying Larry Scott's record in 1968. Oliva returned in 1969 looking better than ever before. I mean, for 1969, or any decade for that matter, this was a revolutionary physique. Back development second to none. So considering your Reg Parks and your Bill Pearls were not getting any younger, IFBB was rapidly becoming the biggest force in bodybuilding. And that year in 69, Arnold Schwarzenegger hit the scene, and he gave Sergio Oliva a run for his money, I'm here to tell you. But at the end of the day, Sergio Oliva did reign supreme, fetching a very rare victory over one Arnold Schwarzenegger. Following year, Arnold returned with a vengeance, and in 1970, Arnold Schwarzenegger became the youngest to date Mr. Olympia champion. Now, here lies in the opportunity for the IFBB to overthrow NABBA. So how did Joe Weider and Arnold Schwarzenegger do it? Well, they went over to NABBA. Arnold went to the NABBA universe in 1970 and not only took that title, more importantly, got a victory over Reg Park. So, Joe Weider and Arnold then went back over to the IFBB and never competed in NABBA again. This must have really frustrated fans, as Bill Pearl returned the following year and challenged all comers at the 1971 NABBA Pro Universe contest. Reg Park showed up, Sergio Oliva also showed up, so where was Arnold? According to Joe Weider, anybody that competed in this NABBA event would be banned from any of the upcoming IFBB events, which didn't really make sense or add up, considering Arnold competed for both NABBA and the IFBB. Unfortunately for Reg Park, who was, with all due respect, past his prime, placed third in this lineup. So it was down to Sergio Oliva and Bill Pearl. And Pearl retained his NABBA Pro Mr. Universe title. And in 1971, after he won that championship, he retired from bodybuilding for good. And there lie in the opportunity for Arnold Schwarzenegger and Joe Weider to make the IFBB the biggest force in all of bodybuilding. Arnold, of course, easily won the 1971 Mr. Olympia contest because everybody else was banned, according to Joe Weider. So Arnold actually won unopposed, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it. In 1972, he was definitely anything but unopposed. Look at this all-star lineup. You have Franco Columbu, Serge Nabret, Sergio Oliva, Arnold Schwarzenegger himself, and Frank Zane at the end. Other than Serge Nubret, every one of these gentlemen went on to win an Olympia title, or 2 or 3 for that matter. As usual, it came down to Sergio Oliva and Arnold Schwarzenegger. With Arnold getting the win, he got the Duke, and still till this day. This creates controversy among bodybuilding fans who claim Sergio Oliva should have most certainly won the title in 1972. To add more controversy to Sergio's career, he was disqualified from the 1973 Mr. International competition. I believe then he's seen the writing on the walls and continued on his bodybuilding career in other federations, such as the WBBG. Years later, Sergio did make his return into the IFBB, competing at the 1984 and the 85 Mr. Olympia contest, but he was never really a threat to that title ever again. But back to Arnold Schwarzenegger, get to the chopper. In 1973, he was looking better than ever before. He easily captured his 4th Olympia title. The contenders that year were Franco Columbu and Serge Nubret. 1974. This was Arnold Schwarzenegger solidifying himself as the greatest bodybuilder of all time. He not only put on more mass, but he was just as conditioned than ever before. You can see the rest of the 74 Olympia lineup here. That's Franco Columbu showing his superior back development. Frank Zane there. And there was a new face on the Olympia scene, Lou Ferrigno. And of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's kind of being out-angled by the camera. Don't be fooled, guys. He's a pretty big dude. All the way big dude. This year was a little bit interesting because they introduced the lightweight class. There was Frank Zane and Franco Columbu both competing in that class, and Franco Columbu got the Duke. Lou Ferrigno managed to place second to Arnold in the heavyweight class, and that is Lou Ferrigno's highest placing at the Olympia. Now, inconspicuous by his absence here was Serge Nubret. He placed 3rd at this event, but I searched high and low, and there was no pictures of Serge from that event. I find that quite puzzling. In 1975, it was the same 3 in the heavyweight class. Serge Nubret, who actually can be seen in photos from 75. Arnold Schwarzenegger, he of course captured his 6th Olympia title in a row. Lou Ferrigno, who placed 2nd the year before, actually placed 3rd in this lineup. Disappointingly, Franco Columbu took the lightweight title that year, looking better than ever, I have to say. He went head-to-head against Arnold Schwarzenegger for the overall title, and of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger took that title and he announced his retirement from professional bodybuilding. And with the absence of Arnold, the following year in 1976, Franco Columbu made history by not only winning the lightweight class, but going on to win the overall title, and he was the very first lightweight class winner to do so. In 1977, Frank Zane took the Olympia title, and it is definitely worth to mention there was an absence of Franco Columbu and, of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger. This was the first year of the Sandow statue for the IFBB, so food for thought on that one. Zane would capture his 2nd Mr. Olympia title in 1978, followed up by a 3rd in 1979. And that would have been his last, because in 1980, controversy struck as Arnold Schwarzenegger himself came out of retirement and took the Olympia title. It's worth to mention that in 1980, they did away with the whole lightweight class, so pretty much all of the guys were on stage at once. Considering the competition that year was more fierce than ever, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, with all due respect, was way out of his prime, it became the most controversial Olympia decision of all time. That is, until the very next year, 1981. Franco Columbu, apparently he's seen what Arnold did and decided to do the exact same thing. He returned and earned his very first ever Sandow statue and his 2nd Olympia title. And competition was just as good or arguably better that year. with guys like Tom Platz, you can see here, and Danny Padilla looked tremendous that year as well. 1982 brought a new face on the horizon and a brand new Olympia champion in Chris Dickerson, who, food for thought, placed second in 1980 and in 1981. A fresh face? Well, on the contrary, Chris Dickerson was older than Arnold and Franco. He became the oldest ever Mr. Olympia champion at 43 years young. You can see his trainer there, one of, if not my favorite bodybuilder of all time, Bill Pearl. Samir Banu would win the 1983 Mr. Olympia title. And in doing so, he brought perhaps the best back development that the Olympia stage has ever seen, and perhaps the bodybuilding world at that time. I mean, this rear double bicep pose from Samir, even after seeing today's competitors, this is still impressive to me. Then we moved on to 1984, and Lee Haney captured the Olympia title. So if you're taking count, that is 6 years and 6 different Olympia champions. And that is very interesting to me. You had Frank Zane, 79, Arnold, 80, Franco Colombo, 81, Chris Dickerson, 82, Samir Banu, 83, and finally settled on Lee Haney in 84. Ladies and gentlemen, that will never happen again. It never happened before. It will never change hands that many times in a row. And like I said, it's settled with Lee Haney, and boy did it. Lee captured the title again in 85, 86, 87, 88, again in 1989, and at this point, he was hogging so many Olympia titles and so many Sandows that I believe the IFBB had to introduce a new contest, the Arnold Classic, and Rich Gaspari won that competition. Gaspari, of course, who placed second to Lee Haney in 86, 87, and in 88, I'm sure was very hungry for the title, so it was well deserved. As for Lee Haney, he went on to the 1990 Mr. Olympia event and tied the record of Arnold Schwarzenegger with 7 Olympia wins. Food for thought here. The 1990 Mr. Olympia event was the one and only drug-tested event. At this point, Lee Haney really had no choice but to go on to the 1991 Olympia event and at least attempt to break Arnold Schwarzenegger's record by winning 8 Olympia titles. And there definitely stood a juggernaut in his way in Dorian Yates, but as the smoke cleared, Lee Haney won his 8th title, breaking the record of Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had 7 Mr. Olympia titles. Lee Haney was perhaps the most dominant Olympia champion of all time, reigning from 1984 all the way to 1991. And then he decided to retire, and with the absence of him, Dorian Yates capitalized with a big win in 1992, capturing his first Mr. Olympia title. Dorian would return and solidify himself as Mr. Olympia in 1993, and he shocked the bodybuilding world with the amount of size and conditioning that he brought to the stage. He single-handedly began what's known as the mass monster era. Winning the title in 1993 showed the bodybuilding world and the bodybuilders themselves that the judges were definitely favoring mass and conditioning over all else. Yates would capture the Olympia title 4 more times in 1994, 95, 96, and one last time in 1997. During his reign, of course, he was not without great opposition. Guys like Kevin Levrone, who placed second in 1992 and again in 1995, really pushed Yates to controversial wins, I might add. 1993, Flex Wheeler was tremendous, and aesthetically speaking, he could get a victory over any bodybuilder. Sean Ray pushed Dorian Yates to the limits in 1994, and once again in 1996, with 2 second-place finishes. In 1997, there was a juggernaut so big that the bodybuilding world had to take note of this guy. Nasser Al-Sanbadi caught a very controversial second-place finish at the 1997 Mr. Olympia, and people still till this very day claim that he is an uncrowned Mr. Olympia. With the absence of Dorian Yates the following year, every one of those guys must have been salivating at the prospect of taking an Olympia title. Who took center stage? Why, it was Flex Wheeler, Nasser Al-Sunbody, and who's that? Why, it was Ronnie Coleman. Ronnie Coleman was in the first call out here, and it surprised everybody, I'm sure, considering Ronnie placed 9th in 1997, just 1 year prior. So he was on nobody's radar for the win. And that's exactly what he did. He took his first Olympia title in 1998. Much like Lee Haney and Dorian Yates before him, Ronnie Coleman dominated the bodybuilding world for years, capturing the title again in 99, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, which is arguably his best version, 04 once again, and then again in 2005. And in doing so, he tied the record of Lee Haney with 8 Olympia titles. Coleman, of course, returned in 2006 to attempt to break Lee Haney's record by winning 9 Olympia titles. But in his way stood Jay Cutler. And the funny thing is, Jay Cutler had placed second to Ronnie Coleman 4 out of the 8 Olympia wins. So when the judges announced the winner to be Jay Cutler, I am sure it made it that much sweeter. And as for Ronnie Coleman, he never did go on to defeat Lee Haney's record, but he did tie it nonetheless. Coleman competed one more time at the 2007 Mr. Olympia event, placing 4th. Jay, of course, returned and captured his second Mr. Olympia title, but not without controversy. The following year, at the 2008 event, it came down to Dexter the Blade Jackson and, of course, Jay Cutler. The judges announced Dexter the Blade Jackson for the big win, and he became the 2008 Mr. Olympia champion. Also, in 2008, it is worth to mention, the IFBB decided to reintroduce the lightweight class. Now, in the past, it was known as the under 200-pound class. This time, it was known as the 202, and it is what we know today as the 212 class. David Henry placed first here, becoming the very first ever lightweight champion, or 202 champion. Kevin English in second, and you may recognize the guy that placed third. That's Flex James Lewis. He went on to win the title from 2012 all the way to 2018. But for now, back to the open class and back to 2009. Jay Cutler returned with a vengeance to recapture his title. And that was a feat that has never been done before. No other bodybuilder has ever lost the Olympia title and came back to win it. And this was Jay Cutler's 3rd title. He returned in 2010 and won his 4th and final Sandow statue. In 2011, he met with bitter opposition in Phil Heath. Actually, they were buddies. They were best friends. Much like 2010, it had come down to Phil Heath and Jay Cutler. But unlike 2010, this time Phil Heath was the victor. He had won his very first ever Sandow statue. He was Mr. Olympia, and he carried on in 2012, 2013. He won also in 2014, little bit debatable, but he took the title in 2015 once again, and 16 as well. Also in 2016, the IFBB introduced the Men's Classic Physique division, and that year at the Olympia, the first champion was crowned in Danny Hester. This division has come a long way, with guys like Chris Bumstead becoming a 3-time champion at the 2021 Olympia. But back to the open class and back to 2017, Phil Heath captured his 7th Olympia title, tying the record of one Arnold Schwarzenegger. Fast forward to 2018, it came down to Sean Roden and Phil Heath. What a tense moment, and with legendary announcer Bob Ciccarello able to make it even more tense, it made for quite a moment indeed. Sean Roden was announced champion, and myself, I was surprised. I personally thought that Phil Heath was going to reign as champion and tie the record of Lee Haney and Ronnie King Coleman, but it was not meant to be. In 2019, with a very depleted lineup, Brandon Curry reigned supreme that year. And it is definitely worth to mention that Sean Roden or Phil Heath were not in that event. So because of that depleted lineup, Brandon Curry took some harsh criticism. So come the 2020 Mr. Olympia event, he was eager to redeem himself, and with a returning Phil Heath, it made the situation all that much more interesting. But the two of them should have had their sights set on the near 300-pound juggernaut from Egypt, Big Ramy. In the end, the Egyptian reigned supreme, with Brandon Curry taking the second place finish. Phil, of course, in third. And as I stated at the beginning of this video, Big Ramy also won the 2021 Mr. Olympia event, becoming a two-time champion, tying the record of one Franco Colombo. Before I finish up, I would like to personally thank each and every one of the bodybuilders mentioned in this video. Without them, we would not have great events like the Mr. Olympia. I would also like to thank you, the fans, because without you guys, bodybuilding would not exist. I hope you enjoyed this video and even learned something along the way. I know I did. So until next time, this is Marx Max Muscle, signing off.